This is an audiobook edition of Jawaharlal Nehru's autobiography,
produced and narrated by Giribala Joshi.
Chapter 47. What is religion? Our peaceful and monotonous routine in jail was suddenly upset in the middle of September 1932 by a bombshell. News came that Gandhiji had decided to fast unto death in disapproval of the separate electorates given by Mr. Ramsay MacDonald's communal award to the depressed classes. What a capacity he had to give shocks to people! Suddenly all manner of ideas rushed into my head. All kinds of possibilities and contingencies rose up before me and upset my equilibrium completely. For 2 days I was in darkness with no light to show the way out, my heart sinking when I thought of some results of Gandhiji's action. The personal aspect was powerful enough, and I thought with anguish that I might not see him again. It was over a year ago that I had seen him last on board ship on the way to England. Was that going to be my last sight of him? And then I felt annoyed with him for choosing a side issue for his final sacrifice, just a question of electorate. What would be the result on our freedom movement? Would not the larger issues fade into the background, for the time being at least? And if he attained his immediate object and got a joint electorate for the depressed classes, would not that result in a reaction and a feeling that something has been achieved and nothing more need be done for a while? And was not his action a recognition, and in part an acceptance, of the communal award and the general scheme of things as sponsored by the government? Was this consistent with non-cooperation and civil disobedience? After so much sacrifice and brave endeavor, was our movement to tail off into something insignificant? I felt angry with him at his religious and sentimental approach to a political question and his frequent references to God in connection with it. He even seemed to suggest that God had indicated the very date of the fast. What a terrible example to set! If Bapu died, what would India be like then, and how would her politics run? There seemed to be a dreary and dismal future ahead, and despair seized my heart when I thought of it. So I thought, and confusion reigned in my head, and anger and hopelessness, and love for him who was the cause of this upheaval. I hardly knew what to do, and I was irritable and short-tempered with everybody, and most of all with myself. And then a strange thing happened to me. I had quite an emotional crisis, and at the end of it I felt calmer, and the future seemed not so dark. Bapu had a curious knack of doing the right thing at the psychological moment, and it might be that his action, impossible to justify as it was from my point of view, would lead to great results, not only in the narrow field in which it was confined, but in the wider aspects of our national struggle. And even if Bapu died, our struggle for freedom would go on, so whatever happened, one must keep ready and fit for it. Having made up my mind to face even Gandhiji's death without flinching, I felt calm and collected and ready to face the world and all it might offer. Then came news of the tremendous upheaval all over the country, a magic wave of enthusiasm running through Hindu society, and untouchability appeared to be doomed. What a magician, I thought, was this little man sitting in Yerwada prison, and how well he knew how to pull the strings that move people's hearts. A telegram from him reached me. It was the first message I had received from him since my conviction, and it did me good to hear from him after that long interval. In this telegram he said, "During all these days of agony you have been before mind's eye. I am most anxious to know your opinion. You know how I value your opinion. Saw Indu and Sarup's children. Indu looked happy and in possession of more flesh, doing very well. Wire reply, love." It was extraordinary, and yet it was characteristic of him that in the agony of his fast, and in the midst of his many preoccupations, he should refer to the visit of my daughter and my sister's children to him, and even mention that Indira had put on flesh. My sister was also in prison then, and all these children were at school in Pune. He never forgets the seemingly little things in life which really mean so much. News also came to me just then that some settlement had been reached over the electorate issue. The superintendent of the jail was good enough to allow me to send an answer to Gandhiji, and I sent him the following telegram. Your telegram and brief news that some settlement reached filled me with relief and joy. First news of your decision to fast caused mental agony and confusion, but ultimately optimism triumphed and I regained peace of mind. No sacrifice too great for suppressed downtrodden classes. Freedom must be judged by freedom of lowest, but feel danger of other issues obscuring only goal. Am unable to judge from religious viewpoint. Danger your methods being exploited by others, but how can I presume to advise a magician? Love. A pact was signed by various people gathered in Poona, and with unusual speed the British Prime Minister accepted it and varied his previous award accordingly, and the fast was broken. I dislike such pacts and agreements greatly, but I welcomed the Poona Pact apart from its contents. The excitement was over, and we reverted to our jail routine. News of the Harijan movement and of Gandhiji's activities from prison came to us, and I was not very happy about it. There was no doubt that a tremendous push had been given to the movement to end untouchability and raise the unhappy, depressed classes, not so much by the pact as by the crusading enthusiasm created all over the country. That was to be welcomed. But it was equally obvious that civil disobedience had suffered. The country's attention had been diverted to other issues, and many Congress workers had turned to the Harijan cause. Probably most of these people wanted an excuse to revert to safer activities, which did not involve the risk of jail going, or worse still, lathi blows and confiscations of property. That was natural, and it was not fair to expect all the thousands of our workers to keep always ready for intense suffering and the breakup and destruction of their homes. But still it was painful to watch this slow decay of our great movement. Civil disobedience was, however, still going on, and occasionally there were mass demonstrations like the Calcutta Congress in March-April 1933. Gandhiji was in Yerwada prison, but he had been given certain privileges to meet people and issue directions for the Harijan movements. Somehow this took away from the sting of his being in prison. All this depressed me. Many months later, early in May 1933, Gandhiji began his 21-day fast. The first news of this had again come as a shock to me, but I accepted it as an inevitable occurrence and schooled myself to it. Indeed, I was irritated that people should urge him to give it up after he had made up his mind and declared it to the public. For me the fast was an incomprehensible thing, and if I had been asked before the decision had been taken, I would certainly have spoken strongly against it. But I attached great value to Gandhiji's word, and it seemed to me wrong for anyone to try to make him break it, in a personal matter which, to him, was of supreme importance. So unhappy as I was, I put up with it. A few days before beginning his fast, he wrote to me, a typical letter which moved me very much. As he asked for a reply, I sent him the following telegram. Your letter. What can I say about matters I do not understand? I feel lost in strange country where you are the only familiar landmark, and I try to grope my way in dark, but I stumble. Whatever happens, my love and thoughts will be with you. I had struggled against my utter disapproval of his act and my desire not to hurt him. I felt, however, that I had not sent him a cheerful message, and now that he was bent on undergoing his terrible ordeal, which might even end in his death, I ought to cheer him up as much as I could. Little things make a difference psychologically, and he would have to strain every nerve to survive. I felt also that we should accept whatever happened, even his death, if unhappily it should occur, with a stout heart. So I sent him another telegram. Now that you are launched on your great enterprise, may I send you again love and greetings and assure you that I feel more clearly now that whatever happens it is well, and whatever happens you win. He survived the fast. On the first day of it, he was discharged from prison, and on his advice, civil disobedience was suspended for 6 weeks. Again, I watched the emotional upheaval of the country during the fast, and I wondered more and more if this was the right method in politics. It seemed to be sheer revivalism, and clear thinking had not a ghost of a chance against it. All India, or most of it, stared reverently at the Mahatma and expected him to perform miracle after miracle and put an end to untouchability and get Swaraj and so on, and did precious little itself. And Gandhiji did not encourage others to think. His insistence was only on purity and sacrifice. I felt that I was drifting further and further away from him mentally, in spite of my strong emotional attachment to him. Often enough, he was guided in his political activities by an unerring instinct. He had the flair for action, but was the way of faith the right way to train a nation? It might pay for a short while, but in the long run. And I could not understand how he could accept, as he seemed to do, the present social order, which was based on violence and conflict. Within me also conflict raged, and I was torn between rival loyalties. I knew that there was trouble ahead for me when the enforced protection of jail was removed. I felt lonely and homeless, and India, to whom I had given my love and for whom I had labored, seemed a strange and bewildering land to me. Was it my fault that I could not enter into the spirit and ways of thinking of my countrymen? Even with my closest associates, I felt that an invisible barrier came between us, and unhappy at being unable to overcome it, I shrank back into my shell. The old world seemed to envelop them, the old world of past ideologies, hopes, and desires. The new world was yet far distant. Wandering between two worlds, one dead, the other powerless to be born, with nowhere yet to rest his head. India is supposed to be a religious country above everything else, and Hindu and Moslem and Sikh and others take pride in their faiths and testify to their truth by breaking heads. The spectacle of what is called religion, or at any rate organized religion, in India and elsewhere has filled me with horror, and I have frequently condemned it and wished to make a clean sweep of it. Almost always it seems to stand for blind belief and reaction, dogma and bigotry, superstition and exploitation, and the preservation of vested interests. And yet I knew well that there was something else in it, something which supplied a deep inner craving of human beings. How else could it have been the tremendous power it has been and brought peace and comfort to innumerable tortured souls? Was that peace merely the shelter of blind belief and absence of questioning, the calm that comes from being safe in harbor, protected from the storms of the open sea, or was it something more? In some cases certainly it was something more. But organized religion, whatever its past may have been, today is very largely an empty form, devoid of real content. Mr. G.K. Chesterton has compared it, not his own particular brand of religion but others, to a fossil, which is the form of an animal or organism from which all its own organic substance has entirely disappeared, but which has kept its shape because it has been filled up by some totally different substance, and even where something of value still remains, it is enveloped by other and harmful contents. That seems to have happened in our Eastern religions as well as in the Western. The Church of England is perhaps the most obvious example of a religion which is not a religion in any real sense of the word. Partly that applies to all organized Protestantism, but the Church of England has probably gone further because it has long been a state political department. Footnote: in India, the Church of England has been almost indistinguishable from the government. The officially paid, out of Indian revenues, priests and chaplains are the symbols of the imperial power just as the higher services are. The Church has been, on the whole, a conservative and reactionary force in Indian politics and generally opposed to reform or advance. The average missionary is usually wholly ignorant of India's past history and culture and does not take the slightest trouble to find out what it was or is. He is more interested in pointing out the sins and failings of the heathen. Of course, there have been many fine exceptions. India does not possess a more devoted friend than Charlie Andrews, whose abounding love and spirit of service and overflowing friendliness it is a joy to have. The Krista Seva Sangh of Pune contains some 1 Englishmen whose religion has led them to understand and serve, and not to patronize, and who have devoted themselves with all their great gifts to a selfless service of the Indian people. There are many other English churchmen whose memory is treasured in India. The Archbishop of Canterbury, speaking in the House of Lords on December 12, 1934, referred to the preamble of the Montagu-Chelmsford Reforms of 1919 and said that he sometimes thought the Great Declaration had been somewhat hastily made, and supposed that it was one of the hasty, generous gestures after the war, but the goal set could not be withdrawn. It is worthy of note that the head of the English Church should take such an exceedingly conservative view of Indian politics. A step which was considered wholly insufficient by Indian opinion, and which because of this led to non-cooperation and all its consequences, is considered by the Archbishop as hasty and generous. It is a comforting doctrine from the point of view of the English ruling classes, and no doubt this conviction of their own generosity, even to the point of rashness, must produce a righteous glow of satisfaction. End of footnote. Many of its votaries are undoubtedly of the highest character, but it is remarkable how that church has served the purposes of British imperialism and given both capitalism and imperialism a moral and Christian covering. It has sought to justify, from the highest ethical standards, British predatory policy in Asia and Africa, and given that extraordinary and enviable feeling of being always in the right to the English. Whether the Church has helped in producing this attitude of smug rectitude or is itself a product of it, I do not know. Other less favoured countries on the continent of Europe and in America often accuse the English of hypocrisy. Perfide Albion is an old taunt, but the accusation is probably the outcome of envy at British success, and certainly no other imperialist power can afford to throw stones at England, for its own record is equally shady. No nation that is consciously hypocritical could have the reserves of strength that the British have repeatedly shown, and the brand of religion which they have adopted has apparently helped them in this by blunting their moral susceptibilities where their own interests were concerned. Other peoples and nations have often behaved far worse than the British have done, but they have never succeeded quite to the same extent in making a virtue of what profited them. All of us find it remarkably easy to spot the mote in the other's eye and overlook the beam in our own, but perhaps the British excel at this performance. Footnote: a recent instance of how the Church of England indirectly influences politics in India has come to my notice. At a provincial conference of the UP Indian Christians held at Kanpur on the 7th November 1934, the chairman of the reception committee, Mr. E. V. David, said, "As Christians, we are bound by our religion to loyalty to the King who is the defender of our faith." Inevitably, that meant support of British imperialism in India. Mr. David further expressed his sympathies with some of the views of the die-hard conservative elements in England in regard to the ICS, the police, and the whole proposed constitution, which, according to them, might endanger Christian missions in India. End of footnote. Protestantism tried to adapt itself to new conditions and wanted to have the best of both worlds. It succeeded remarkably so far as this world was concerned, but from the religious point of view it fell, as an organized religion, between two stools, and religion gradually gave place to sentimentality and big business. Roman Catholicism escaped this fate, as it stuck onto the old stool, and so long as that stool holds, it will flourish. Today it seems to be the only living religion, in the restricted sense of the word, in the West. A Roman Catholic friend sent me in prison many books on Catholicism and papal encyclicals, and I read them with interest. Studying them, I realized the hold it had on such large numbers of people. It offered, as Islam and popular Hinduism offer, a safe anchorage from doubt and mental conflict, an assurance of a future life which will make up for the deficiencies of this life. I am afraid it is impossible for me to seek harbourage in this way. I prefer the open sea, with all its storms and tempests. Nor am I greatly interested in the afterlife, in what happens after death. I find the problems of this life sufficiently absorbing to fill my mind. The traditional Chinese outlook, fundamentally ethical and yet irreligious or tinged with religious skepticism, has an appeal for me, though in its application to life I may not agree. It is the Tao, the path to be followed and the way of life that interests me. How to understand life, not to reject it, but to accept it, to conform to it and to improve it. But the usual religious outlook does not concern itself with this world. It seems to me to be the enemy of clear thought, for it is based not only on the acceptance without demur of certain fixed and unalterable theories and dogmas, but also on sentiment and emotion and passion. It is far removed from what I consider spiritually and things of the spirit, and it deliberately or unconsciously shuts its eyes to reality, lest reality may not fit in with preconceived notions. It is narrow and intolerant of other opinions and ideas. It is self-centered and egotistic, and it often allows itself to be exploited by self-seekers and opportunists. This does not mean that men of religion have not been and are not still often of the highest moral and spiritual type. But it does mean that the religious outlook does not help, and even hinders, the moral and spiritual progress of a people, if morality and spirituality are to be judged by this world's standards and not by the hereafter. Usually religion becomes a social quest for God or the Absolute, and the religious man is concerned far more with his own salvation than with the good of society. The mystic tries to rid himself of self, and in the process usually becomes obsessed with it. Moral standards have no relation to social needs, but are based on a highly metaphysical doctrine of sin. An organized religion invariably becomes a vested interest and thus inevitably a reactionary force opposing change and progress. It is well known that the Christian Church in the early days did not help the slaves to improve their social status. The slaves became the feudal serfs of the Middle Ages of Europe because of economic conditions. The attitude of the Church as late as 200 years ago, in 1727, was well exemplified in a letter written by the Bishop of London to the slave owners of the southern colonies of America. Footnote: this letter is quoted in Reinhold Niebuhr's Moral Man and Immoral Society, page 78, a book which is exceedingly interesting and stimulating. End of footnote. Christianity, wrote the bishop, and the embracing of the gospel does not make the least alteration in civil property or in any of the duties which belong to civil relations, but in all these respects it continues persons just in the same state as it found them. The freedom which Christianity gives is freedom from the bondage of sin and Satan and from the dominion of men's lusts and passions and inordinate desires. But as to their outward condition, whatever that was before, whether bond or free, their being baptized and becoming Christians makes no manner of change in them. No organized religion today will express itself in this outspoken manner, but essentially its attitude to property and the existing social order will be the same. Words are well known to be, by themselves, very imperfect means of communication and are often understood in a variety of ways. No word, perhaps, in any language is more likely to be interpreted in different ways by different people as the word religion or the corresponding words in other languages. Probably to no two persons will the same complex of ideas and images arise on hearing or reading this word. Among these ideas and images may be those of rites and ceremonial, of sacred books, of a community of people, of certain dogmas, of morals, reverence, love, fear, hatred, charity, sacrifice, asceticism, fasting, feasting, prayer, ancient history, marriage, death, the next world, of riots and the breaking of heads, and so on. Apart from the tremendous confusion caused by this immense variety of images and interpretations, almost invariably there will be a strong emotional response which will make dispassionate consideration impossible. The word religion has lost all precise significance, if it ever had it, and only causes confusion and gives rise to interminable debate and argument, when often enough entirely different meanings are attached to it. It would be far better if it was dropped from use altogether, and other words with more limited meanings were used instead, such as theology, philosophy, morals, ethics, spirituality, metaphysics, duty, ceremonial, etc. Even these words are vague enough, but they have a much more limited range than religion. A great advantage would be that these words have not yet attached to themselves, to the same extent, the passions and emotions that surround and develop the word religion. What then is religion? To use the word in spite of its obvious disadvantages. Probably it consists of the inner development of the individual, the evolution of his consciousness in a certain direction, which is considered good. What that direction is will again be a matter for debate. But, as far as I understand it, religion lays stress on this inner change and considers outward change as but the projection of this inner development. There can be no doubt that this inner development powerfully influences the outer environment. But it is equally obvious that the outer environment powerfully influences the inner development. Both act and interact on each other. It is a commonplace that in the modern industrial West outward development has far outstripped the inner, but it does not follow, as many people in the 1960s East appear to imagine, that because we are industrially backward and our external development has been slow, therefore our inner evolution has been greater. That is one of the delusions with which we try to comfort ourselves and try to overcome our feeling of inferiority. It may be that individuals can rise above circumstances and environment and reach great inner heights. But for large groups and nations, a certain measure of external development is essential before the inner evolution can take place. A man who is the victim of economic circumstances and who is hedged and restricted by the struggle to live can very rarely achieve inner consciousness of any high degree. A class that is downtrodden and exploited can never progress inwardly. A nation which is politically and economically subject to another and hedged and circumscribed and exploited can never achieve inner growth. Thus, even for inner development, external freedom and a suitable environment become necessary. In the attempt to gain this outer freedom and to change the environment so as to remove all hindrances to inner development, it is desirable that the means should be such as not to defeat the real object in view. I take it that when Gandhiji says that the means are more important than the end, he has something of this kind in view. But the means should be such as lead to the end, otherwise they are wasted effort, and they might even result in even greater degradation, both outer and inner. No man can live without religion, Gandhiji has written somewhere. There are some who in the egotism of their reason declare that they have nothing to do with religion, but that is like a man saying that he breathes, but that he has no nose. Again he says, "My devotion to truth has drawn me into the field of politics, and I can say without the slightest hesitation, and yet in all humility, that those who say that religion has nothing to do with politics do not know what religion means." Perhaps it would have been more correct if he had said that most of these people who want to exclude religion from life and politics mean by that word religion something very different from what he means. It is obvious that he is using it in a sense, probably moral and ethical, more than any other, different from that of the critics of religion. This use of the same word with different meanings makes mutual comprehension still more difficult. A very modern definition of religion, with which the men of religion will not agree, is that of Professor John Dewey. According to him, religion is whatever introduces genuine perspective into the piecemeal and shifting episodes of existence, or again, any activity pursued in behalf of an ideal end against obstacles and in spite of threats of personal loss because of conviction of its general and enduring value is religious in quality. If this is religion, then surely no one can have the slightest objection to it. Romain Rolland also has stretched religion to mean something which will probably horrify the orthodox of organized religions. In his Life of Ramkrishna, he says, "Many souls who are, or who believe they are, free from all religious relief, but who in reality live immersed in a state of super-rational consciousness, which they term socialism, communism, humanitarianism, nationalism, and even rationalism. It is the quality of thought and not its object which determines its source and allows us to decide whether or not it emanates from religion. If it turns fearlessly towards the search for truth at all costs, with single-minded sincerity prepared for any sacrifice, I should call it religious, for it presupposes faith in an end to human effort higher than the life of existing society, and even higher than the life of humanity as a whole. Skepticism itself, when it proceeds from vigorous natures true to the core, when it is an expression of strength and not of weakness, joins in the march of the grand army of the religious soul. I cannot presume to fulfill the conditions laid down by Romain Rolland, but on these terms I am prepared to be a humble camp follower of the grand army. End of chapter 47. Chapter 48. The Dual Policy of the British Government. The Harijan movement was going on, guided by Gandhiji from Yervda prison and later from outside. There was a great agitation for removing the barriers to temple entry, and a bill to that effect was introduced in the Legislative Assembly. And then the remarkable spectacle was witnessed of an outstanding leader of the Congress going from house to house in Delhi, visiting the members of the Assembly and canvassing for their votes for this temple entry bill. Gandhiji himself sent an appeal through him to the Assembly members. And yet civil disobedience was still going on, and people were going to prison, and the Assembly had been boycotted by the Congress, and all our members had withdrawn from it. The rump that remained and the others who had filled the vacancies had distinguished themselves in this crisis by opposition to the Congress and support of the government. A majority of them had helped the government to pass repressive legislation giving some permanence to the extraordinary provisions of the ordinances. They had swallowed the Ottawa Pact, they had fed and feasted with the great ones in Delhi and Shimla and London, and joined in the thank offerings for British rule in India, and prayed for the success of what was called the dual policy in India. I was amazed at Gandhiji's appeal under the circumstances then existing, and even more so by the strenuous efforts of Rajgopalachari, who, a few weeks before, had been the acting president of the Congress. Civil disobedience, of course, suffered by these activities, but what hurt me more was the moral side. To me, for Gandhiji or any Congress leader to countenance such activities appeared immoral and almost a breach of faith with the large numbers of people in jail or carrying on the struggle. But I knew that his way of looking at it was different. The government attitude to this temple entry bill, then and subsequently, was very revealing. It put every possible difficulty in the way of its promoters, went on postponing it and encouraging opposition to it, and then finally declared its own opposition to it and killed it. That, to a greater or lesser extent, has been its attitude to all measures of social reform in India, and on the plea of non-interference with religion, it has prevented social progress. But this, it need hardly be said, has not prevented it from criticizing our social evils and encouraging others to do so. By a fluke, the Sharda Child Marriage Restraint Bill became law, but the subsequent history of this unhappy act showed more than anything else how much averse to enforcing any such measure the government was. The government that could produce ordinances overnight, creating novel offences and providing for vicarious punishment, and could send scores of thousands of people to prison for breach of their provisions, apparently failed at the prospect of enforcing one of its regular laws, like the Sharda Act. The effect of the act was first to increase tremendously the very evil it was intended to combat, for people rushed to take advantage of the intervening 6 months of grace which the act very foolishly allowed. And then it was discovered that the act was more or less of a joke, and could be easily ignored without any steps being taken by government. Not even the slightest attempt at propaganda was made officially, and most people in the villages never knew what the act was. They heard distorted accounts of it from Hindu and Muslim village preachers, who themselves seldom knew the correct facts. This extraordinary spirit of toleration of social evils in India, which the British government has shown, is obviously not due to any partiality for them. It is true that they do not very much care about their removal, for these evils do not interfere with their business of governing India and exploiting her resources. There is also always the danger of irritating various people by proposing social reforms, and having to face enough anger and irritation on the political plane, the British government has no desire whatever to add to its troubles. But latterly, the position has become worse from the point of view of the social reformer, for the British are becoming more and more the silent bulwarks of these evils. This is due to their close association with the most reactionary elements in India. As opposition to their rule increases, they have to seek strange allies, and today the firmest champions of British rule in India are the extreme communalists and the religious reactionaries and obscurantists. The Muslim communal organizations are notoriously reactionary from every point of view, political, economic, social. The Hindu Mahasabha rivals them, but it is left far behind in this backward-moving race by the Sanatanists, who combine religious obscurantism of an extreme type with fervent, or at any rate loudly expressed, loyalty to British rule. If the British government was quiescent and took no steps to popularize the Charter Act and to enforce it, why did not the Congress or other non-official organizations carry on propaganda in favor of it? This question is often put by British and other foreign critics. So far as the Congress is concerned, it has been engaged during the last 15 years, and especially since 1930, in a fierce life-and-death struggle for national freedom with the British rulers. The other organizations have no real strength or contact with the masses. Men and women of ideals and force of character and influence among the masses were drawn into the Congress and spent much of their time in British prisons. Other organizations could seldom go beyond the passing of resolutions by select people who feared the mass touch. They functioned in a gentlemanly way, or like the All India Women's Association, in a ladylike way, and the spirit of aggressive propaganda was not theirs. Besides, they too were paralyzed by the terrible repression of all public activities by the ordinances and the laws that followed them. Martial law may crush revolutionary activity, but at the same time it paralyzes civilization and most civilized activities. But the real reason why the Congress and other non-official organizations cannot do much for social reform goes deeper. We suffer from the disease of nationalism, and that absorbs our attention, and it will continue to do so till we get political freedom. As Bernard Shaw has said, "A conquered nation is like a man with cancer, he can think of nothing else." There is indeed no greater curse to a nation than a nationalist movement, which is only the agonizing symptom of a suppressed natural function. Conquered nations lose their place in the world's march, because they can do nothing but strive to get rid of their nationalist movements by recovering their national liberty. Past experience shows us that we can make little social progress under present conditions in spite of apparent transfers of subjects to elected ministers. The tremendous inertia of the government is always helpful to the conservative elements, and for generations past the British government has crushed initiative and ruled despotically or paternally, as it has itself called it. It does not approve of any big organized effort by non-officials, and suspects ulterior motives. The Harijan movement, in spite of every precaution taken by its organizers, has occasionally come in conflict with officials. I am sure that if the Congress started a nationwide propaganda for the greater use of soap, it would come in conflict with government in many places. I do not think it is very difficult to convert the masses to social reform if the state takes the matter in hand. But alien rulers are always suspect, and they cannot go far in the process of conversion. If the alien element was removed and economic changes were given precedence, an energetic administration could easily introduce far-reaching social reforms. But social reform and the Charter Act and the Harijan movement did not fill our minds in prison, except in so far as I felt a little irritated by the Harijan movement because it had come in the way of civil disobedience. Early in May 1933, civil disobedience had been suspended for 6 weeks, and we waited anxiously for further developments. That suspension had given a final blow to the movement, for one cannot play fast and loose with a national struggle and switch it on and off at will. Even before the suspension, the leadership of the movement had been singularly weak and ineffective. There were petty conferences being held, and all manner of rumours spread which militated against active work. Some of the acting presidents of the Congress were very estimable men, but it was unkindness to them to make them generals of an active campaign. There was too much of a hint of tiredness about them, of a desire to get out of a difficult position. There was some discontent against this vacillation and indecision in high quarters, but it was difficult to express it in an organized way, as all Congress bodies were unlawful. Then came Gandhiji's 21-day fast, his discharge from prison, and the suspension of civil disobedience for 6 weeks. The fast was over, and very slowly he recovered from it. In the middle of June, the period of suspension of civil disobedience was extended by another 6 weeks. Meanwhile, the government had in no way toned down its aggression. In the Andaman Islands, political prisoners, those convicted in Bengal for acts of revolutionary violence were sent there, were on hunger strike on the question of treatment, and 1 or 2 of them died, starved to death. Others lay dying. People who addressed meetings in India in protest of what was happening in the Andamans were themselves arrested and sentenced. We were not only to suffer, but we were not even to complain, even though prisoners died by the terrible ordeal of the hunger strike, having no other means of protest open to them. Some months later, in September 1933, when I was out of prison, an appeal was issued over a number of signatures including Rabindranath Tagore, C.F. Andrews, and many other well-known people, mostly unconnected with the Congress, asking for more humanitarian treatment of the Andamans prisoners, and preferably for their transfer to Indian jails. The Home Member of the Government of India expressed his great displeasure at this statement and criticized the signatories strongly for their sympathy for the prisoners. Later, as far as I can remember, the expression of such sympathy was made a punishable offence in Bengal. Before the second 6 weeks of suspension of civil disobedience were over, news came to us in Dehradun jail that Gandhiji had called an informal conference at Pune. 200 or 300 people met there, and on Gandhiji's advice, mass civil disobedience was suspended, but individual civil disobedience was permitted, and all secret methods were barred. The decisions were not very inspiring, but I did not particularly object to them so far as they went. To stop mass civil disobedience was to recognize and stabilize existing conditions, for in reality there was no mass movement then. Secret work was merely a pretense that we were carrying on, and often it demoralized, having regard to the character of our movement. To some extent it was necessary in order to send instructions and keep contacts, but civil disobedience itself could not be secret. What surprised me and distressed me was the absence of any real discussion at Pune of the existing situation and of our objectives. Congressmen had met together after nearly 2 years of fierce conflict and repression, and much had happened meanwhile in the world at large and in India, including the publication of the White Paper containing the British government's proposals for constitutional reform. We had to put up during this period with enforced silence, and on the other side there had been ceaseless and perverted propaganda to obscure the issues. It was frequently stated, not only by supporters of the government but by liberals and others, that the Congress had given up its objective of independence. The least that should have been done, I thought, was to lay stress on our political objective, to make it clear again, and, if possible, to add to it social and economic objectives. Instead of this, the discussion seems to have been entirely confined to the relative merits of mass and individual civil disobedience, and the desirability or otherwise of secrecy. There was also some strange talk of peace with the government. Gandhiji sent a telegram to the Viceroy, as far as I remember, asking for an interview, to which the Viceroy replied with a no, and then Gandhiji sent a second telegram mentioning something about honorable peace. Where was this elusive peace that was being sought, when the government was triumphantly trying to crush the nation in every way and people were starving to death in the Andamans. But I knew that, whatever happened, it was Gandhiji's way always to offer the olive branch. Repression was going on in full swing, and all the special laws suppressing public activities were in force. In February 1933, even a memorial meeting on my father's death anniversary was prohibited by the police, although it was a non-Congress meeting and such a good moderate as Sir Tej Bahadur Sapru was to have presided over it. And as a vision of future favours to come, we had been presented with the white paper. This was a remarkable document, a perusal of which left one gasping for breath. India was to be converted into a glorified Indian state, with a dominating influence of the state's feudal representatives in the federation. But in the states themselves, no outside interference would be tolerated, and undiluted autocracy would continue to prevail there. The real imperial links, the chains of debt, would bind us forever to the City of London, and the currency and monetary policy would also be controlled, through a reserve bank, by the Bank of England. There would be an impregnable defence of all vested rights, and additional vested interests were going to be created. Our revenues were mortgaged up to the hilt for the benefit of these vested interests. The great imperial services which we love so much would continue uncontrolled and untouched to train us for further installments of self-government. There was going to be provincial autonomy, but the governor would be a benevolent and all-powerful dictator, keeping us in order. And high above all would sit the all-highest, the supreme dictator, the viceroy, with complete powers to do what he will and check when he desires. Truly, the genius of the British ruling class for colonial government was never more in evidence, and well may the Hitlers and Mussolinis admire them and look with envy on the Viceroy of India. Having produced a constitution which tied up India hand and foot, a collection of special responsibilities and safeguards were added as additional letters, making the unhappy country a prisoner incapable of movement. As Mr. Neville Chamberlain said, they had done their best to surround the proposals with all the safeguards the wit of man could devise. Further, we were informed that for these favours we would have to pay heavily, to begin with a lump sum of a few crores and then annual payment. We could not have the blessings of Swaraj without adequate payment. We had been suffering under the delusion that India was poverty-stricken and already had too heavy a burden to carry, and we had looked to freedom to lighten it. That had been for the masses the urge for freedom, but it now appeared that the burden was to become heavier. This Gilbertian solution of the Indian problem was offered with true British grace, and we were told how generous our rulers were. Never before had an imperial power of its own free will offered such power and opportunities to a subject people. And a great debate arose in England between the donors and those who, horrified at such generosity, objected to it. This was the outcome of the many comings and goings between India and England during 3 years, of the 3 round-table conferences, and innumerable committees and consultations. But the visits to England were not over yet. There was the Joint Select Committee of the British Parliament which was going to sit in judgment on the White Paper, and Indians went to it as a kind of assessors and as witnesses. There were also many other committees sitting in London, and there was an undignified scramble behind the scenes for membership of any committee which meant a free passage to and stay in the heart of the empire. Brave men, undaunted by the petrifying provisions of the White Paper, undertook to face the perils of the sea voyage or the air journey, and the greater dangers of a stay in London City, in order to attempt, with all the eloquence and power of persuasion at their command, to vary the provisions of the White Paper. They knew and said that the task was an almost hopeless one, but they were no quitters, and would continue to have their say even though there was no one to listen to them. One of them, a leader of the responsivists, stuck on till the bitter end, when all others had left, probably having interview after interview and dinner after dinner with the men in authority in London, so that he might impress upon them what political changes he desired. When at last he returned to his native land, he informed an expectant public that, with the well-known tenacity of the Marathas, he had refused to give up his job, and had stayed on in London to have his say to the very end. I remember a frequent complaint of my father's that his responsivist friends had no sense of humour. He often got into trouble with them because of his humorous remarks, which were not appreciated by them at all, and then he had to explain and soothe, a tiring operation. And I thought of the fine fighting spirit of the Marathas, not only in the past, but in the present during our national struggles, and of the great and indomitable Tilak, who would not bend though he brake. The Liberals utterly disliked the White Paper. They also had no liking for the repression that was going on from day to day in India, and sometimes, though rarely, even protested against it, always making it clear that they condemned the Congress and all its works. They would suggest to government occasionally to release some prominent congressmen from prison. They could only think in terms of individuals they knew. The argument advanced, both by the Liberals and Responsivists, was that so-and-so should be released as there was no longer any danger to the public peace. And then it is always open to the government to rearrest that person if he misbehaves, and government could do so with more justification. Some people in England also were good enough to plead for the release of some members of the working committee or special individuals on these grounds. We could not help being grateful to people who were interested in us while we were in prison, but we felt also sometimes that it would be a good thing if we were saved from our well-meaning friends. We did not doubt their good intentions, but it was obvious that they had adopted completely the ideology of the British government, and between them and us there was a wide chasm. The Liberals did not like much that was happening in India. They were unhappy about it, and yet what were they to do? It was unthinkable for them to take any effective action against government. Merely to preserve themselves as a separate entity, they had to retreat further away from the masses and the active elements in the population, to drift to the right, till their ideology was hardly distinguishable from that of the government. Small in numbers and with no mass influence, they could not make any difference to a mass struggle. But among them were some distinguished and well-known persons who were personally respected. And these leaders, as well as the Liberal and Responsivist groups as a whole, did an inestimable service to the British government at a moment of grave crisis by a moral support of the official policy. Even the coercion and lawlessness of government profited by the lack of effective criticism and occasional acquiescence and approval of the Liberals. Thus the Liberals and Responsivists gave a moral sanction to the fierce and unprecedented coercion that was going on in the country at a time when the government was hard put to it to justify it. The White Paper was bad, very bad, so said the Liberal leaders. What was to be done about it? At the Liberal Federation meeting held in Calcutta in April 1933, Mr. Srinivas Shastri, the most eminent of the Liberal leaders, pleaded that however unsatisfactory the constitutional changes might be, they should work them. "This is no time to stand by and let things pass," he said. The only action that apparently was conceivable to him was to accept what was given and to try to work it. The alternative to this was doing nothing. Further, he added, "If we have wisdom, experience, moderation, power of persuasion, quiet influence, and real efficiency, if we have these virtues, this is the time to display them in the fullest strength." Shining words was the Calcutta statesman's comment on this eloquent appeal. Mr. Shastri is always eloquent, and has the orator's love of fine words and their musical use. But he is apt to be carried away by his enthusiasms, and the word magic that he creates blurs his meaning to others and perhaps to himself. It is worthwhile examining this appeal he made at Calcutta in April 1933 during the continuance of the civil disobedience movement. Fundamental principles and objectives apart, 2 points seem to me worthy of note. The first is that whatever happens, however much we might be insulted, crushed, humiliated, and exploited by the British government, we must submit to it. The line can never be drawn beyond which we must not go. A worm may turn, but not the Indian people if they followed Mr. Shastri's advice. There is no other way according to him. This means that, so far as he is concerned, submission to and acceptance of the British government's decisions is tantamount to a religion, if I may use that unfortunate word. It is the fate, kismet, to which all of us have to bow whether we want to or not. It must be noted that he was not giving advice on a definite, known situation. The constitutional changes were still in the making, though one had a fair notion that they would be very bad. If he had said that, bad as the white paper proposals are, having regard to all the circumstances, I am in favour of working them, should they be enacted, his advice might have been good or bad, but it had relation to existing facts. Mr. Shastri went much further, and said that however unsatisfactory the constitutional changes might be, his advice would hold. He was prepared to give a blank cheque to the British government on the most vital matter from the nation's viewpoint. It is a little difficult for me to understand how any individual, group, or party can take up this attitude of commitment to an unforeseen future unless it has no principles or moral and political standards whatever, and has for its creed and policy invariable subservience to the ruler's mandates. The second point that strikes me is one of pure tactics. The White Paper was one stage in the long march to the enactment of the new reforms. It was, from government's point of view, an important stage, but many stages remained, and it was possible that it might be altered for better or worse during its subsequent journey. These alterations would obviously depend on the pressure brought to bear on the British government and Parliament from various interests. In this tug-of-war, it was conceivable that the desire to win over the Indian Liberals to its side might have influenced the government and induced it to liberalize the proposals or at least to resist encroachments. But Mr. Shastri's emphatic declaration, long before the question of acceptance or rejection, working or not working the new reforms arose, made it clear to the government that they could completely ignore the Indian Liberals. There was no question of winning them over. They would not desert the government, even if they were pushed out. Looking at the matter from the Liberal viewpoint as far as I can, Mr. Shastri's speech at Calcutta seems to me to have been extraordinarily bad tactics and injurious to the Liberal cause. I have ventured to write so much on Mr. Shastri's old speech, not because of any intrinsic importance of that speech or the Liberal Federation meeting, but because of my desire to understand the mentality and psychology of the Liberal leaders. They are able and estimable men, and yet, with the best will in the world, I have been wholly unable to appreciate why they act as they do. Another speech of Mr. Shastri's, which I read in prison, influenced me greatly. He was addressing the Servants of India Society, of which he is president, at Pune in June 1933. He is reported to have pointed the danger in India, if British influence were suddenly withdrawn, of political movements being marked by acute hatred, persecution, and oppression of one party by another. On the other hand, toleration having throughout been a feature of British political life, the more India's future is worked out in cooperation with Britain, the greater the likelihood of toleration prevailing in India. Being in prison, I have to rely on the summary of Mr. Shastri's speech given by the statesman of Calcutta. The statesman added, "It is a pleasant doctrine, and we note that Dr. Munjay has been speaking in the same sense." Mr. Shastri is further reported to have referred to the suppression of freedom in Russia, Italy, and Germany, and to the inhumanities and savageries that were being perpetrated there. It struck me when I read this how extraordinarily similar was Mr. Shastri's outlook in regard to Britain and India to that of the die-hard British Conservative. In matters of detail there were no doubt differences, but fundamentally the ideology was the same. Mr. Winston Churchill could have expressed himself in identical language without doing any violence to his convictions. And yet Mr. Shastri belongs to the left wing of the Liberal Party and is the ablest of its leaders. I am afraid I am wholly unable to accept Mr. Shastri's reading of history or his views on world affairs, and more particularly on Britain and India. Probably no foreigner who is not an Englishman will accept them. Possibly many Englishmen of advanced views will disagree with him. It is his happy gift to see the world and his own country through the tinted glasses of the British ruling class. Nevertheless, it is remarkable that he should ignore in this speech the very unusual occurrence which had taken place from day to day in India during the previous 18 months, and were taking place at the time the speech was delivered. He referred to Russia, Italy, and Germany, but not to the fierce repression and suppression of all liberties in his own country. He may not have known of all the terrible occurrences in the frontier province and in Bengal, the rape of Bengal, as Rajendra Babu has called it in his recent Congress presidential address, as the heavy veil of censorship hid much of what was happening. But was he oblivious to the agony of India and the struggle for life and freedom that his people were waging against a powerful adversary? Did he not know of the police raj that prevailed over large areas, of conditions resembling martial law, of the ordinances, of the hunger strikes, and other sufferings in prison? Did he not realize that the very toleration and freedom for which he praised Britain had been crushed by Britain herself in India? It did not matter whether he agreed with the Congress or not. He was perfectly entitled to criticize and condemn Congress policy. But as an Indian, as a lover of freedom, as a sensitive man, what were his reactions to the wonderful courage and sacrifice of his countrymen and countrywomen? Did he not feel any pain and anguish when our rulers played with a hatchet on India's heart? Was it nothing to him that scores of thousands were refusing to bend before the physical might of a proud empire and preferred to see their bodies crushed, their homes broken, their dear ones suffer, rather than yield their souls? We put on a brave face in jail or outside, and smiled and laughed, but we smiled often through our tears, and our laughter was sometimes near to crying. Mr. Verrier Elwin, a brave and generous Englishman, tells us what his reactions were. It was a wonderful experience, he says of 1930, to watch a whole nation throwing off its mental bonds of servitude and rising to its true dignity of fearless determination. And again, the amazing discipline exhibited by most of the Congress volunteers during the Satyagrah struggle, a discipline to which one of the provincial governors has borne generous testimony. Mr. Srinivas Shastri is an able and sensitive man who is widely respected by his countrymen, and it seems impossible that he would not react in the same way and feel for his countrymen during such a struggle. One would have expected him to raise his voice in denunciation of the suppression of all civil liberty and all public activities by the government. One would further have hoped that he and his colleagues would personally visit the worst affected areas, Bengal and the frontier, not in any way to help the Congress or civil disobedience, but to expose and thus check official and police excesses. This is usually done by the lovers of freedom and civil liberty in other countries. But instead of acting in this way, instead of trying to check the executive when it was riding roughshod over India's men and women, and had done away with even the usual liberties, instead at least of finding out what was happening, he chose to give a certificate to the British for toleration and freedom just when both of these virtues were completely lacking under British rule in India. He gave them his moral backing and thus heartened and encouraged them in their task of repression. I am quite sure that he could not have meant this or realized the consequences of his action. But that his speech must have had this effect cannot be doubted. Why then should he think and act in this manner? I have found no adequate answer to this question, except that the liberal leaders have cut themselves completely aloof from their countrymen as well as from all modern thought. The musty books that they read have shut out the people of India from their view, and they have developed a kind of narcissism. We went to jail, and our bodies were locked up in cells, but our minds ranged free, and our spirits were undismayed. But they created mental prisons of their own fashioning, where they went round and from which they found no escape. They worshipped the God of things as they are, and when things changed, as they do in this changing world, they were without rudder and compass, helpless in mind and body, without ideals or moral values. The choice for each one of us always is to go forward or be pushed. We cannot remain static in a dynamic universe. Afraid of change and movement, the liberals were frightened at the tempest that surrounded them. Weak of limb, they could not go forward, and so they were tossed hither and thither, clutching at every straw that came their way. They became the Hamlets of Indian politics, sicklied o'er with the pale cast of thought, ever doubting, hesitating, and irresolute. The time is out of joint, O cursed spite, that ever I was born to set it right. The Servant of India, a liberal weekly, accused congressmen, during the latter days of the civil disobedience movement, of wanting to go to prison, and when they got there, wanting to come out again. That, it said with some irritation, was the sole Congress policy. The liberal alternative to that, apparently, was to send a deputation to England to wait on the British ministers, or to wait and pray for a change of government in England. It was true to some extent that the Congress policy then was mainly one of defiance of the ordinance laws and other repressive measures, and this led to jail. It was also true that the Congress and the nation were exhausted after the long struggle, and could not bring any effective pressure on the government. But there was a practical and moral consideration. Naked coercion, as India was experiencing, is an expensive affair for the rulers. Even for them, it is a painful and nerve-shaking ordeal, and they know well that ultimately it weakens their foundations. It exposes continually the real character of their rule, both to the people coerced and the world at large. They infinitely prefer to put on the velvet glove to hide the iron fist. Nothing is more irritating and, in the final analysis, harmful to a government than to have to deal with people who will not bend to its will, whatever the consequences. So even sporadic defiance of the repressive measures had value. It strengthened the people and sapped the morale of government. The moral consideration was even more important. In a famous passage, Thoreau has said, "At a time when men and women are unjustly imprisoned, the place for just men and women is also in prison." This advice may not appeal to liberals and others, but many of us often feel that a moral life under existing conditions is intolerable, when, even apart from civil disobedience, many of our colleagues are always in prison and the coercive apparatus of the state is continually repressing us and humiliating us, as well as helping in the exploitation of our people. In our own country we move about as suspects, shadowed and watched, our words recorded lest they infringe the all-pervading law of sedition, our correspondence opened, the possibility of some executive prohibition or arrest always facing us. For us the choice is abject submission to the power of the state, spiritual degradation, the denial of the truth that is in us, and our moral prostitution for purposes that we consider base, or opposition with all the consequences thereof. No one likes to go to jail or to invite trouble, but often jail is preferable to the other alternative. The only real tragedy in life, as Bernard Shaw has written, is the being used by personally minded men for purposes which you know to be base. All the rest is at the worst mere misfortune and mortality. This alone is misery, slavery, hell on earth. End of chapter 48.